Welcome to the Back40 Leadership Podcast, Season 2, Episode 6. My name is Michael Bond, and I will be one of your hosts today. I am sitting here with Pastors Colin McKnight.
Hey, how's it going?
And Todd Stanley.
Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, or whenever you may be listening to this podcast. How's it going, guys?
So real quick, before we jump in, I want to invite you to give this podcast a 5-star rating and write us a review. We are on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. We are there. Also, share this on social media and tell your friends about it. Remember to subscribe at summitpodcasts.church/subscribe. This is the network where all of our Summit podcasts are distributed. Subscribing will allow you to receive email notifications every time we release new content here at Summit Church. Today, we are going to discuss pastoring in spiritually depressed areas. But before we get into that, let's discuss this week in church leadership.
All right. Do I go first?
Go for it.
All right. So, I came across this article, and I thought it would be a good conversation starter for us. It's nothing particularly crazy about the article. It was an article about a church in Birmingham, so down in Alabama, that purchased a restaurant called Kale Me Crazy, but not that really matters. But anyway, they purchased a restaurant and are going to be owning and operating this restaurant as a part of their ministry in the city. And business as ministry or business as mission is not necessarily a new thing, but I think especially for like rural church leaders, this may be something that would be really good for them to explore because it could bring some economic development maybe to a smaller town. It gives another opportunity for outreach in their community. It provides, there's just all kinds of things that it can kind of be a catalyst for. And so I thought I would throw that out there for you guys and see, what do you think about the idea of business as mission? What do you think about churches entering into that? What are maybe the sticky points of that? Because I know, from a tax standpoint and that kind of thing, there can be questions, but I'll just throw that out on the table and you guys share your thoughts.
Wow, that's wild. So yeah, this is not anything new. Obviously, we've seen churches have like jump parks, like trampoline parks, or start businesses. The sticky thing that I think like with this is what a huge distraction this could be, and especially if you're not the right person to lead a business, man, you could just get yourself into a lot of trouble and end up spending your time again taking care of tax stuff and taking care of business things that can distract you from sharing the gospel, what you're there, initially for. But I think it takes a really specific person to be able to balance that. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I'm seeing these pop up more and more, in particular coffee shops. I've seen a couple coffee shops here, even here in Pennsylvania, that double as like a Bible study / small group. Some might even call it church at night. They'll flip the whole room, they'll set up tables. And I think that these are coming up by necessity. I think that church planning is becoming more difficult for people. And so they think, well, if we have an additional revenue stream and something that we do during the day in terms of business, then we can fund our church also. The two dangers, I would say, would be having the right person. Colin, you touched on this, like human resources would be an issue there, because are you a business person or are you a pastor, or are you a pastor who is also a business person? Because a business person could do really well under that model who's not a very good pastor. And so then you would have maybe a situation where some false teaching would show up or people would be led astray. Or maybe you have a pastor who's not particularly well-versed in business and trying to operate a business, which is a whole nother arena. And so maybe we can talk about the reasons why church planters are finding this hybrid model necessary. And the other danger, I should say, would be people attending these hybrids in place of the local church. I don't know if the hybrid setup can achieve everything in terms of spiritual development and volunteering and giving of yourself back to the community that the local church is able to do. What are your thoughts on that? Can they be a fully functional church?
I think they can be. And I think there are a couple different models that we maybe could wrestle with, but if you're talking about, like a coffee shop style business as mission model where they use that venue for meetings and for church and that kind of thing, I think it can be a fully functioning church if it's done well and done right. So, for example, if the coffee shop weren't open on Sunday, right, and they actually have a full-fledged service, and I've had friends who planted in that way, and then obviously there will come a point at which you will outgrow that space, hopefully, right? Outgrow that venue.
Could be a really big coffee shop, just saying.
Yeah. And so, but once you outgrow that venue, then you have other issues and questions to deal with. But I think it can be a fully functioning church in that way. And even, you don't have to have a space to meet in necessarily to go and do outreach in your community. And so, like from a throughout the week standpoint, the venue is really of little consequence. There are plenty of portable churches and things like that who operate without a meeting space during the week that are utilizing coffee shops and whatever else, And so I think it can be. I think the second thing is that outside of the idea of using it as a church planter, like this church in Birmingham, for example, that they purchased a restaurant to, as part of their ministry. And what if there's a video attached to the article, then they interviewed the pastor, and he was talking about this is a predominantly African-American church. And so what they want to do, he said there's very little availability for healthy food options in the Black community, right? In those areas of the city that are maybe a little more economically depressed or, whatever else, there's not food availability there, at least healthy food options. And so for them as a church, one of the things that they said is we can serve our community by creating healthy food options in these communities. And so then it provides an opportunity for outreach. Mm-hmm. And so that's a little bit different model. Mm-hmm. And so as a church planter, you may be looking at something like, okay, this can be something that can help sustain our church, right? We can afford a venue if we're using that venue as business throughout the week. Mm-hmm. The other model is if you're an established church, let's say you're a pastor in a small community, and you go, what's a need that's in our community that we can meet by opening a small business? And then use that as a way of serving the community. And it just happens because you're utilizing a business model, it sustains itself, and it's not something that the church has to just funnel money into, because you may not have that kind of budget. But if it's a self-sustaining kind of thing, then you can create something that can grow on its own. Mm-hmm. And then even beyond that, once you get to a place where that business is turning a profit, so to speak, you can then take the revenue that business is creating and invest that into your community as well. Mm-hmm. And so those are the kind of questions I think you have to.
I don't want to sound overly critical. I mean, obviously this church has decided and got approval from their body or their board to move forward with that. So I don't want to sound critical of what they're doing, but there are some sides to it. Again, for me personally, that just seems like a lot more danger. Now, if you're adding value to your community, one of the decisions you have to make is this something that we are leveraging our church budget towards because it adds so much value to the community? Then let's just do it. Let's just offer that. Or, does it benefit the community if people come into, like, for say this restaurant or even like a coffee house or whatever? Are we making them cover the costs for this? But what are the additional costs? People, product, just this revenue source. Man, that's just such a sticky area. Like, that's so gray. I'm not really sure if you're again, like a food desert situation, like it sounds like this. I think that's what they call them, food deserts, like in a community. Yeah. If you had somebody in your church that said, "Hey, I'm a restaurant owner and I'm a successful, at this, then let me offer this as my service to the church." Man, that's great. You've got one of the most pivotal elements of that is the person with know-how. But man, that conversations down the way, you have to communicate over and over again what your purpose is and what your end goal is. Just like anything you would in the church. Man, that would get exhausting.
Yeah, I think the big question ends up being, what is the business doing with the profits? Like that if it's using the profits to start new locations, like new restaurants, new places, I love the idea of meeting like the practical need in that way. Because if someone doesn't have food, like that's quickly going to rise to the very top of their priority list. I mean, even more so than attending church, even more so than spiritual concerns. They won't feel the importance of the spiritual concerns as much as they're going to feel the importance of the need for food. Yeah, I think ultimately in determining whether or not it is ethical, we could say, would be like what's happening with the profits, what's happening with the revenue that it's generating. Because then if you're doing something, if you're leveraging the profits to do even more good, then you could justify the business model over something that's just pure charity.
Yeah. Well, if your end goal is profit, I mean, again, if your end goal is we're adding value and we're okay with this amount of loss. I mean, restaurants operate on loss. Chain restaurants do all the time, and they kind of figure out how to make it work. Again, establishing your end goal, I think, is super important.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say too that, this isn't just a question as far as how monies are utilized. Isn't just a question for business's mission. I mean, we see, unfortunately, in the church all the time where funds are misused, misappropriated, where there's problems. And so that's, to me, an integrity issue that has to be addressed well before you decide whether you're going to be business as mission. The business as mission question really becomes more, to me, an idea of what is God calling us to? How can we meet needs in our community? And do we have the resources to do it, right? Which human resource not being the least of those. For most of us as pastors, like I know for me, I don't have the bandwidth or the time or the space to run a small business in addition to the things that I do as a pastor, right? And so you have to ask those questions as well, and figure those things out. And if you're going into it for the idea of turning a profit, well, to me, as a church leader, you're going into it with the wrong question in mind anyway. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need to count the cost and that it doesn't need to be self-sustaining. I think that the scripture is clear that if we're going to build a tower, that we should count the cost. We're going to, so we need to know what we're looking at, and we need to know whether that business model is self-sustaining, whether it's going to be able to accomplish the thing that we're wanting it to accomplish. But profit should not be the question that we're asking.
Sure, and this could be highly effective. I mean, it is. You look at the world missions models that, where you send people into sensitive countries and they're experts in tourism in that area. First of all, they're not from there, but yeah, sure, they start up a touring company, or they start up a tea house, or they start up a coffee shop where they can offer conversation and people can learn English or whatever language. And, that model seems to work to add value and to start conversations. And so, I mean, is it successful? Sure. But again, to the limit of the vision and the people involved.
Yeah. I mean, you need to know what God's calling you to do as a church leader or as a church community and all those kinds of things. But I think that anytime we can leverage opportunities like that to increase our reach and to bring the gospel to bear on people's lives, that we need to do that. Or prayerfully consider that. Maybe I should say it that way. And we also need to recognize that, look, this is a model that is as old as the church itself. Paul was a tent maker, right? Mm-hmm. And so he was making tents as a means of funding the ministry. He even talks about it in those terms. Mm-hmm. And so we need to understand that this is not by any means a new concept. And Paul advocated it, as well as advocating that other churches support the work of the ministry. So we see both of those things, in the scriptures themselves. It's just a matter of what God is calling us to do.
Yeah, I mean, that seals it for me. Like, I'm thinking about that example that Paul shows us, definitely. And it might be the case that as churches begin to lose tax-exempt status, that this kind of thing becomes more necessary, that churches having to function as businesses, or at least take on more principles that businesses have.
Yeah.
Because, the businesses have been operating under tax, since there's been a tax.
Yeah.
Okay, so Together for Christ is like a Reformed evangelical conference, a pretty big one. I think like 3,000 people. Albert Mohler is the founder of it, and they're going to stop meeting. Like and the way it's described, Together for Christ, the conference was always meant to be finite. It wasn't supposed to go on forever. Some people have speculated that the idea of the big Christian conferences is going to become harder and harder to pull off because of the divisions caused by political ideology. And so my question for you is, do you think that the church is entering into an age where the gathering, like the conference, is becoming maybe not the most ideal thing for churches to be doing in terms of unity? Do you think we have too many conferences? Like, do you think that there's too many on offer? Do you think that that's like the highest goal of like a church network or for a church to have its own conference? Like, do you think that that's something that too many bigger churches are trying to achieve just for the sake of being able to say that they have one? Like, what's your thoughts on the conference?
Wow, talk about mixing business with nonprofit. Conferences, there's so much money that goes into that. Merchandise sales, ticket sales, but then also the cost of venue and production. Man, that's what's my opinion going to really change someone's mind if they've already invested in something so great like that? I'm going to start with the perspective of, no, I don't think that the church is any more divided today, according to political ideology, than it has throughout history. Again, that was part of the question to begin with. I think we just see it more often. We just pass the microphone better now. Everybody can put out a mean tweet or be critical of another believer and their thoughts about the smallest, most ridiculous things. But conferences, they're either successful, depending on how you measure it, but they're sustained by ticket sales and by merch sales and by people being involved. So in that mindset, the consumer's going to decide whether a conference continues. I almost named a few, but just depending, some of these that I was greatly influenced, early on in my walk with Christ, don't exist anymore. The big men's conferences, where they brought in athletes and, filled stadiums full of men, all over the United States and parts of the world all over. But they cease to exist based on kind of, again, ticket sales are down, and then administratively, they just couldn't continue that. So I think conferences will rise and fall like individual ones, but I don't think we're out. Like, I don't think we can see the end of those yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the church will look very different as we move forward, because our world will look very different. And the church has always had to adapt and change with culture. Now, the gospel should never change, right? The message should never change, but the methodologies always change. I'm not going to prognosticate about conferences or, whether they'll be around or whether they won't. I think Colin's right. Some of them will fade. Others will other new ones will start. Some will continue. Who knows how that will go? I think we'll see a trend of, and here I go prognosticating, I guess.
Here we go.
I think we'll see a trend of conferences being online, as being able to engage with other people online becomes easier. I think that I think that we'll see those kinds of things happening, both because the cost of doing something is so much less online, and because our world is increasingly online. So I think we'll see things like that. So like large groups of people gathered in a single room, we may see less of that, but large groups of people gathering to discuss ideas, that's never going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I think conferences are, I mean, a lot of them come about because there's a need, right?
Yeah.
Either you have a message, or you have a community that's underserved, a region, like for instance, doing a large women's conference in southwestern Pennsylvania. Like, okay, so what does that look like? What is your goal? Okay, so we've reached this many people and there's still a need. Or, often we don't get a speaker to this region, or, this caliber of teaching or resources given. And okay, so we need a bigger place. I think, naturally that happens as need, or if there's a certain teaching or teacher that, has a following and says, hey, I want to reach this particular group, but I need to offer more room. That just happens.
Yeah.
But online, I mean, as the need grows, like you can reach more people online than you can in person. I mean, come on. And
theoretically,
if they participate, right? But then, as people need the resource will, hopefully be provided by people that can offer it.
Well, and just from a practical standpoint, as long as pastors and churches are wrestling with the challenges of emerging culture, there will be a need for us to gather and wrestle through those conversations together. There will always be someone who has insight or wisdom, or God has gifted in a particular area that people will want to hear from. I mean, those things aren't going to go away. What it looks like may change, but we're not going to stop trying to learn from one another anytime soon, I hope.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, and we probably touched on this, but like when you have multiple high profile, in demand thought leaders meeting to discuss about something, you're going to get a conference as a consequence of that. Like people are just going to show up. And so definitely like that sense making apparatus is super important. And I hope that it stays around also. Okay, so let's dive into our topic for today, which is a discussion of pastoring in spiritually depressed areas. So let's be careful here. I am saying spiritually depressed areas. So these are areas which would be known maybe for their godlessness. And the question is, and it might be an area where the return on investment is like obviously not going to be good. Should churches try to plant in these areas? Because on the one hand, it seems obvious. Yes, we should, because like we need to go to the lost. But with the way we do church here in the West, do you think that churches plant in these areas very often? And why or why not? And is it a wise idea for a church to try to plant in an area like this? What do you think?
Do I think churches plant in those kind of areas very often? No. Do I think we should be? Yes. I think, unfortunately, even the way the question is couched assumes that the way we're doing things in the West is right. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that we do some things really well, but we do some things really wrongly. Mm-hmm. One of which is that, and our conversation already today has considered some of these things. One of which is that we run the church as a business a lot of times, and not that we don't have to count the cost. I mean, we talked about that already. That the Scripture is clear that if we're going to build something, we need to count the cost of that. But the financial cost is not the only cost we should be counting. We need to count the cost in terms of, the spiritual impact. We need to count the cost in terms of, the souls that are there. What are we willing to lose in order that someone else might gain? And so oftentimes we avoid not just spiritually depressed areas, right? We've not done a good job of planting in economically depressed areas. We've not done a good job of planting in areas where there is population decline, right? Because it's much easier to build a church in a place that is growing economically, that's growing in population, where young families are, all those kinds of things. It's much easier to plant and grow a church in those areas. That ignores the fact that there are people who need Jesus in economically depressed areas, in areas where the population may be dwindling, in areas where spiritually it's just harder, right? Where there's an antagonism toward the gospel. And, and so we need to address those things. We need to look at those things. I think one of the things that we can do is go ahead and plant in that area that's growing and financially vibrant and all those kinds of things. There's nothing wrong with planting in those places. God calls people into those places. But what we need to do then is leverage the resources and the things that those churches have to invest in these other places where the ground is harder to till. Mm-hmm. And so I think those are the conversations that we need to have around that.
Well, I think you hit it right there. God calls people to plant in certain places. I think that should be the very beginning of any church planting strategy. Not, hey, our church in the next 10 years wants to have 10 locations and reach 20,000 people. Like, if that's just strictly from man, if that's just strictly from...
That's not a bad goal.
A really good it's a great... Yeah, sure. What kind of influence could you have with 20,000 people in 10 locations in 10 years? But establishing the fact that, okay, this is the model. We seek God. We seek to be obedient to what God calls us to do. We do it. Like, so whether God's calling you to a suburb of a city because the city is sprawling out and there's an unreached area, there's not churches or there's not an influence there, or if God's calling you into the inner city or into an area very specifically, I think it's upon the leadership to say, we've sought after God and what he's called us to do. He spoke. And now we're being obedient. So, and once you are into that place, there's no question. Should we give 100% to this? Should we go all out to this? Like, that is a very clear way to cast vision and encourage other people in their own personal life within the church. Like, you think discipleship, like seek God when he speaks, be obedient to whatever he's called you to do. And so you could really set yourself up well to locate yourself where funds are good and where there's nice housing developments and things like that. But man, your light shines where God calls you to shine it. I mean, that's really, where it is. Now, as far as areas that are spiritually depressed or have a real, a dark side to it, don't just go running into them. I mean, the gospel doesn't go out void, but if God's not calling you there, then you do yourself just as bad of a disservice to go there anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I think it has a lot to do with listening and obeying.
There's two really interesting ideas nested in this conversation. And the one is that churches have missionaries and churches send missionaries to hostile foreign countries and places where you would typically not want to spread the gospel unless you're very brave or called to do it. So do you think then that churches need a class of specialists, maybe like a revivalist or somebody who is trained at restoring difficult communities, or at least knows how what that process would look like?
I mean, I think we need to do our best to make sure that people are equipped for the work that God is calling them to. We don't send missionaries to a foreign country, for example, without helping them to learn the culture, helping them to learn the language, doing all of those things to help, empower and equip them for the work that God's calling them to. So certainly we need to do those things. Having said that, I don't think that we can always rely on the work of a specialist, so to speak, to spread the gospel. We have to recognize that God uses everyday, ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that if we always are going, well, this seems like the most likely candidate, then we may miss out on something, and so there's discernment that has to be there. And so I think there has to be a dual approach where we do our very best to equip people for the work that God is calling them to. But we also just have a level of discernment where we go, you know what, hey, this person doesn't seem like the most likely candidate, but man, God is doing something here, and so we're gonna get behind that and do our best to support what we see God at work doing there.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one of the most sustaining principles, whether it's foreign missions or local missions, is establishing rapport with locals, with people that are actually from that region, establishing a relationship, and then empowering them as the Lord transforms their life to do the work of that. Mm-hmm. My wife and I support some friends of ours that are missionaries in close countries, actually 3 different close countries, but their only job there in these countries is to establish a relationship with a few people that are local, maybe already believers or brand new believers, or to bring them to Christ and then empower them. Yeah. Their end goal is never for me to come from the West and establish a Western church. That's not their goal. Mm-hmm. And I'm not, they're not going to become pastors of an international church there or anything like that. Their goal is to get there, maintain a relationship, offer resource to people that are locally who know best that territory and how to share the gospel there. And for church planting too, we're in a unique season right now of planting a church in a spiritually depressed location, my wife and I and some of our team. And the best way, the stories that we hear already, the testimonies, are people that attend that church who grew up in that town, whose lives are radically changed by Christ, and they're reaching the people they know in that area. Yeah. It's not me coming in from another state, hey, I know this model, and this is what's going to work, and this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to bring everyone to Christ. It's establishing and local people and discipling your people, the church in general. We could all do a better job of discipling each one of our people, saying, hey, listen, this is not about the pastor on stage. This is not about whoever's, writing the book that you're reading. It's about you and about God working in you and working through you wherever you are, whether that's at work, in your home, at the coffee shop, and empowering people to be missionaries where they are.
Yeah. I almost said I don't want to over-spiritualize this, but here's the thing.
Do it.
Number one, we should never say that. We cannot over-spiritualize something. We believe that God sovereignly directs the activities of his people. We believe that God calls us sometimes to do things that don't make sense. Mm-hmm. We believe that we serve a God who is not confined by space and time or financial concerns or any of those kinds of things. And so over-spiritualize it by all means, right? If that's even possible. What I'm trying to say is spend time with God in prayer and listen to what he's calling you to do, and then go and do it. And it may not make any sense to anybody around you. It may not even make sense to you initially, right? But we're called to obedience and to go and to do the things that God is calling us to do, and know that he goes with us. I often think of, so Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, never had a single convert in his ministry, right? In fact, God's call to him was essentially, hey, Jeremiah, I want you to go and tell these people this. By the way, they're not going to listen. Mm-hmm. By the way, don't expect success, right? And amazingly, Jeremiah says, you got it. Mm-hmm. I'll go. Yeah. Right? We don't see that a lot in modern church culture, where we go, you know what? I'm going to go into this place where success is not only not guaranteed, but probably is not happening. But I'm going because I know God has called me there. I'm going to be, You
have to redefine success.
Yeah. Yeah. And we celebrate those kind of stories. Like, I can't remember the specifics of the story right now, but you've probably heard stories like this, where a missionary is called into a particular place and they go and they labor for years and years and years and they have like one convert, right? And then they die only having had one convert. But that one person then transforms an entire region because they're a local who understands the culture, or because, whatever the case may be. But by any human standard, we would not have measured that missionary's ministry as success except for hindsight. Mm-hmm. We're I can't say too worried, but we are maybe too worried. We're too worried sometimes about foresight.
Right. Yeah.
And what can I predict? And from an economic standpoint, from a human numbers standpoint, we want to be able to have a predictive model, and forecast all of these things. I'm not trying to downplay all of those tools. I'm just trying to say that sometimes that's not the measure of whether or not God's calling me to do something. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, in spite of all those numbers, God is calling me to do something. Because sometimes that's what faith demands. Yeah. That in spite of the fact that it looks like, a suicide mission, so to speak, I'm going anyway. And I'm believing that God's going to go with me. And, I don't know why I feel like this conversation needs to go this way, other than maybe some of you who are listening right now are looking at an impossible situation, but you feel strongly that God is calling you to it. And I would tell you that if you believe strongly that God is calling you to it, then go and do it. Because even if, from a human standpoint, you never see success in that, if you are being obedient, God rewards that, right? Mm-hmm. There's something that he'll develop in you. There's something, maybe that one person that sees what you're doing. Who knows? But we can't measure everything in terms of metrics when it comes to serving God. We just can't.
Well, consider Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. Philip was nobody. Not Philip that we've heard of in the Bible previously. He was just a follower in this new movement of Jesus. But he was called to do something very specific to someone who, because he was a eunuch, was not allowed to go into a temple to learn about God, but was trying and was seeking, sitting in his own carriage. And God, instead of calling Philip to do his own thing, God called him away from his normal path literally into this guy's carriage or whatever he was in, to bring that to him. It was a very specific thing and led with a lot of details. And he was obedient. And a lot of the Ethiopian church today, they pull their lineage spiritually back to this moment. Who's Philip? We don't know. There's a little bit of conjecture about his life, but was he obedient? Yes. Did it make a difference? Yes. So again, like you said, if God is calling you to something and you clearly hear his voice, be obedient. That's the measure of a win right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obedience in that respect, and having the faith, particularly a church. So if a church is the first one that has the faith to make a huge investment in an area that is depressed, other businesses, other people are going to be encouraged by that, and that's going to make them want to invest too. So it does seem to be the case that when people act on faith and whenever they take the leap, that the whole paradigm can be flipped. The charts might not be showing any return at all, but if you go and you do it, you may not reap the harvest now. You may find out, you may be rewarded later, but you may also completely defy all the expectations. And so one of the things, Colin, that you said about the missionaries that I thought was interesting was that their expectations were managed. It's okay, this is what we're going to do. This is the win. We're not going to set up a mega church in this area. We're not going to set up a church, maybe even a whole church, but we're just going to build relationships and disciple people. So how can a church who wants to, or a pastor who wants to help a depressed area or a spiritually depressed area, how can they manage their expectations? Going into it, what would you say to them would be some wise things to hold close in terms of defining the win?
Number one, the win has to be obedience, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there may not be some other kind of things that we want to look at and measure in terms of, we all want to see fruit from our ministry, right? I mean, no one sets out to go, I don't want to reach anybody for Jesus, right? I hope you didn't, because if you did, there's a whole other set of questions there, like, why are you in ministry? But obedience should be our first priority. And beyond that, like if I can, with clear conscience, with clear eyes and a full heart, say I am being obedient to what God has called me to do, then everything else is secondary. Having said that, I think there are some things that, like, if set goals that I don't want to say that are easy to reach, but that are incremental.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want to go, okay, we're going to build a church of however many people in this area, and then not have any like steps of what it looks like to get to that place. I think, look, if I can develop a relationship with one person and see the gospel really make an impact on their life, see God do something in them, that's a win, right? And so, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I mean, it really is one person at a time. It really is, right? There's that old, Colin, you've been around long enough, the whole each one reach one thing.
Sure.
That's really it. I mean, that really is it. It's not any harder than that.
I mean, we're called to bear fruit. So multiplying means that you were faithful in what you did.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I would encourage a pastor that's heard from God or is listening for God to speak, bring in wise counsel. Bring somebody that comes alongside you and can help you count wins that you can't even see. Not to just, build you up or anything, but oftentimes I think you can get real focused on one thing and you have your set expectations, but you need someone to come in with a fresh perspective and say, hey, this was a win. I don't think it completed what you wanted, but we're still moving forward in what God has called you to do. I wouldn't, again, once you've established that God has spoken to you about something, I don't think you need counsel on, okay, well, did God speak? But helping you with the win. Again, like if God's called you to something, man, go 100%. I mean, seek counsel, seek wisdom, people that have done something like this before in similar areas, build relationships with people that are doing something like what God is calling you to do, by all means, not to question whether you've heard from God or that you should or shouldn't be obedient, but so they can help you count wins and manage your expectation. Hey man, I know you're getting really tired and I know you want all these things to happen your first year or your first 6 months or, in this time period, but hey, pump the brakes a little bit and let's count the things that you can't see.
Yeah. And recognize too that church does not have to look like a Sunday gathering with a large group of people sitting in straight rows in front of a stage with a band on it and then a guy who gets up there. And church doesn't have to look like that. There's nothing scripturally that says that that's the model for church. So like, and in fact, in a lot of places in the world, church can't look like that. And yet the church is growing and people are being discipled. Anywhere that you have a group of people who are engaged in the mission of God and who gather together to study the Word of God, to worship, and to, to grow and to learn, and then to bring that good news to other people, that's a church. Anywhere that's happening, regardless of how many people there are in that gathering. And so if you're going into an area where, maybe a large venue isn't even a possibility, right? Or where a really rural area where people live like miles from one another, where like those things are a little more difficult. Well, be creative in that. Like, how can you gather a small group of people in a house and you gather for worship and the study of God's word and teaching it, and then you say, okay, how can we affect our neighbors? How can we bring the gospel to the people that we rub shoulders with? That's a church. That's a church. I think sometimes not sometimes, we have fallen into the trap in Western culture of thinking that it has to look like a mega church, or it has to, look a particular way in order for it to be successful, or in order for it to be something that, that God's really paying attention to. Look, God is not any more impressed by the 15,000 member church on Sunday than he is by the 20 member church on Sunday. God is not impressed with our numbers, right? God is concerned with our faithfulness. And so, like, we've just got to forget about those types of measurement in terms of what it means to be serving God and being effective and successful in the ways that, in the places God has called us to be. Like, Shilakta, Pennsylvania will never have a church of probably 300, right? Because that's as many people as there are in the town, right? It's probably not going to happen, because even if it did, there's that old joke about the guy who's stranded on a deserted island, and they find him, and and he's like, this is the house that I built, and this is my church. And they're like, well, what's that empty building over there? Well, that's the church I used to go to, right? And there's only one guy on the island, and so we need to forget about those kinds of measurements. Yeah.
You mentioned something about the mega church, and if I can just reach out to like my brothers in Christ who are trying to do, or brothers and sisters in Christ who are trying to establish something where there may be a larger church or a community of believers who has greater resources, don't be distracted by that, and don't be put off by that, because there are things that vision of a larger group or a mega church can really get in the way or hinder them in a smaller community. If you are in a neighborhood and God has established you there, you're there for a reason. If God put something on your heart, like He's speaking specifically to you, don't wait until your friend at this other church with these, twice as many resources and, 3 times as many people, until they come around to the idea. No, He's called you to do it. There are some areas, some smaller communities, some subcultures where a large church or a church with a marketed name cannot be established. It does not fit that area. So don't be hindered by that.
In the parable of the talents, the servant was not condemned because he had fewer talents than the other servants. He was condemned because he didn't do anything with what had been placed in his hands, right? That's what we're going to be called into account for. That's what we're going to stand before God and have responsibility for, is what He placed in your hands. So stop comparing what you have in your hands with what somebody else has in their hands. Stop saying, if I only had that, then I could do something. Look, what do you have in your hand? And what are you doing with that? Like, man, comparison, it just kills us. It just kills us. And so rather than asking, what can I do here where God has placed me, we go, man, if I could only be there. And God's not gonna hold you accountable for what Hillsong has, right? Or what, that church down the street from you that, God's not going to hold you accountable for them. He's going to hold you accountable for what He's called you to do and what He's placed in your hands. I'm not going to stand before God and answer for anybody else except Todd. And the reality is, for most of us, if we're looking at what somebody else is doing, it's because we don't want to wrestle with the fact that I'm not being a good steward of what's in my hand already.
Mm-hmm. So both of you, and we can close on this, but both of you are on staff at a medium to large-sized church that has planted in a smaller area. And so speaking to leaders of medium to large-sized churches who are seeking to plant in a smaller area, what are some steps that you've taken to be able to successfully scale down that operation to where like the culture is maintained and maybe like the quality is maintained? Can you speak into what it looks like for a medium to large-sized church to go to a place that is smaller? Like specifically, what ways can they maintain I hate to say the brand, but like, you know what I mean? Like the vision, the DNA of the larger site. How does that get translated? What are some challenges that you've struggled with? And like, what are some steps that you've taken to help ensure that remains connected to the larger entity?
Man, I tell you what, will you ask that to like a few people that have done this more than I have, so then I can just listen to their answer, please? Because I think when you mentioned like, what's been the struggle? I'm like, there's a lot more struggles than there are successes. Wow, there's a lot to that question. How can you add value to a community? I think that's first and foremost should be your focus. Like, okay, God's called us here. How can we add value? You start there, but then you hold on to elements of your culture, like excellence. That's something that we value here. And we talk a lot about what that looks like. You can operate in excellence anywhere. You can operate in, first, excellence starts with self-discipline, right? Personally, if I'm not operating with excellence at some point in my own personal walk, my own personal life, my own home, I can't lead other people to excellence. And there are a lot of very large churches that don't do excellence very well for some reason that they've just been able to grow. But yeah, you can do excellence anywhere, whether you have 5 people coming together or it's you at your home, establishing a home church, or so excellence is something you can scale.
Yeah. I think the first thing you have to do is be comfortable with the idea that it's going to be different. It is going to be different. It's going to be a whole different group of people, right? There's going to be different personalities involved. The community that you're planting in is going to be different. And so the needs of that community and the makeup of that community are going to define in a lot of ways what that location looks like. And of course, we're specifically talking about planting a satellite location. If you're planting a church, that's a whole different thing. Mm-hmm. But from a DNA standpoint, I think, number one, you send people who understand the vision and the mission that you're going for, right? Like for us, healthy relationships is a high value for us, right? So Colin, and I'll just speak to this, right? Colin is our campus pastor at our Blairsville location. He was chosen for that role because he's a person who's highly relational. He lives out that value of healthy relationships. So you send somebody who embodies those values. You send somebody who understands the vision that you have and who lives that out and who's bought into that. Like, if you're planting a church, for example, where like, okay, even if it's a satellite, but there's going to be live teaching, right? Then the things that you're looking for there may be different than what you'd be looking for at a video venue. You have to ask those kinds of questions. And maybe we're getting a little into the weeds, and maybe I'm straying a little bit from the question that you're asking. I think the way, and I'll just try to go back and kind of drill into that. And the way that you ensure that you are keeping that DNA, that culture in place is, number one, you send someone to lead that location who understands the culture, who's bought into the culture. Number two, you consistently communicate vision. I mean, that's the only way that you create culture in the first place, is that you consistently communicate it and embody it for those that you are leading. And so you have to continue to do that. Keep that out in front. Look, just in terms of church in general, we can see how it's easy for a church to drift away from the core of the gospel if they don't keep Jesus front and center. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, keep it simple.
Yeah. And so it's easy for us to like drift into kind of self-help. And here's 4 principles for good parenting. And not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But it's easy for us to drift into that being the focus, rather than, because if we don't consistently communicate that this is about what Christ has done, this is about the gospel, this is about, and it's the same is true in any kind of value that we want to communicate. We have to keep it front and center. And so I think that's part of how you do that, and then be comfortable with the fact that it's going to look a little bit different in every different location because it's different people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you're establishing a second location or multiple locations, or even establishing a new church that is being supported by another church, you need to guard culture very carefully. There's going to be a shared culture, possibly, if you're a second location or multiple location, and you want to guard that. But then there's going to be a unique culture where you are. So that's been something we've been careful about where we are. And I don't think we've got it perfect, but we're establishing that slowly. I mean, the shared culture is already solid, the things that we value and what our mission is. But as far as community relations, I would encourage just slowing down. Stay centered on the gospel, but let the Lord speak to you. Again, we're going back to this obedience, but let the Lord reveal to you the things to get involved with. There are a lot of issues where we are planting right now. There's a lot of social things. There's several huge needs. And as God reveals those things to us, we have to carefully and slowly, methodically go through those and say, is this something that you're calling us to get involved with? Is this one of the things that is going to become part of our identity as a location, as a church? Our model is that we would plant a location, but not always to be a location of Summit Church. Right. This will be its own church eventually in this community. So we're going to establish principles from the beginning that are good for our church in general. Excellence. Again, we value healthy relationships, radical generosity, creative evangelism. Those are things that we value that any church, I think, would benefit from. So, but yeah, balancing shared culture and unique culture for that location.
And we've been talking for a little while now, and so I don't want to belabor the conversation, but I do want to maybe try to bring some practical things in, not only for people who may be looking at planting in a new location or that kind of thing, but hopefully bring some value to people who are who are pastoring right now and asking questions like this. I think there are some practical things. Number one, what's your building look like? That communicates value. When we planted in Blairsville, for example, we wanted, when people walked into that location, for it to feel as much as possible like our Indiana location. This is a Summit Church. And that communicates something to people, right? There's a particular feeling that you have because it's more casual, it's more laid back, it feels kind of modern, it feels, all those kind of things. And we could dismiss those if we wanted to. But the fact of the matter is that creates something. You decorate your home in a particular way because you are communicating a value, right? You are communicating, am I rustic? Am I modern? Am I,
am I a mess?
Right. You're communicating your personality. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what it is. But for some of you, you want your church to be a completely different personality than what it is currently decorated as. And it communicates something, right? it's hard for people to feel relaxed if they walk into a place that feels very formal, right? And so if you're wanting to be welcoming and inviting and open, then if they're walking into a place that feels very formal, you're already like shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. And so ask those kinds of questions. What is it that I want people to feel when they come here? What is it that I want their experience to be like? How can I, communicate who we are from the very outset? How does my building communicate that? How do we communicate that as a people? One of the things that we do at our locations every week when we meet with our team prior to the service is talk about how that someone who's alone in our gathering is an emergency, and that our friends can wait, and that we want to connect those alone people to somebody that, and help them to meet people, right? That communicates value, and it takes some effort, but it's, again, like, why are we here? And so all of that to say, those are the kinds of questions that you have to ask. What is it? Who are we? And how can we communicate that to people in everything that we do? And then make the changes necessary to do that. And for some of you, that may mean navigating committee meetings and all of those kinds of things. And I know that those can be difficult conversations to have, but lead with boldness and communicate vision. More often than not, people will come alongside and follow someone who has a compelling vision. Not 100% of the time, right? There are always going to be those who just are mired in, this is the way we've always done it. But man, I would say 99% of the time, if you have a compelling vision, that voice will be the minority.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, great insight from Colin McKnight and Todd Stanley on moving churches into difficult areas. They have the experience, they have the wisdom, and you have the opportunity to rate and review this podcast wherever you are.
Oh, no.
Thank you so much for listening to the Back40 podcast, and we will see you in the next episode.